Thank you all so much for being here and for people who are watching at home. It's a real honor for me to be invited to do this second keynote. And I'd like to thank the University of Michigan and Matt, wherever Matt is probably doing something. Oh, hello, Matt, in the back. Thank you very much. And to the program committee for having me. So, in the first episode of the Netflix political drama House of Cards, U.S. Representative Frank Underwood attends a lavish gala concert. As the concert begins with Summer from Vivaldi's Four Seasons, the camera fixates on Underwood's reaction. After the first phrase, it cuts to a close-up. Frank appears mesmerized by the music, his focus intently on the off-screen musicians, until we notice the headphones and we realize we've been duped. Although he's still wearing his tuxedo, Frank has abandoned the luxurious surroundings and elite company of the concert hall. Instead, he's sitting on a couch in his basement, riveted not by Vivaldi's music, but by Call of Duty. The subtext underlying this shift is clear. Classical music is socially and culturally celebrated, while video games are shameful, a guilty pleasure to be hidden away from prying eyes. In an instant, how we perceive Frank Underwood changes. How could a U.S. congressman, a patron of the fine arts, close out his evening trash-talking teenagers on an Xbox headset? This scene's effectiveness depends on viewers understanding that classical music and video games are incompatible. One is art, and the other is entertainment. In fact, I would argue that distinction is fundamental to both concepts. The idea of classical music, all academic hand-wringing aside, remains trapped in the conceptual quicksand of art music, a phrase we can and still do substitute willy-nilly. In his 2002 book, Who Needs Classical Music, for instance, Julian Johnson succinctly describes classical music as music that functions as art, as opposed to entertainment or some other background or ancillary function. That opinion isn't limited to scholars. As I speak, for example, the first sentence of Wikipedia's entry on classical music defines it as art music. Falling down the rabbit hole to the art music page reveals its circular definition: music descending from the tradition of Western classical music. Significantly, that article opens with the informative note that art music is also known as formal music, serious music, erudite music, or legitimate music, all terms that clearly reinforce an elitist system of value judgments. At the opposite end of that spectrum, we find video games, which are closely connected with entertainment culture. Consider, for example, two frequently cited academic definitions. In a series of articles that culminated in his book, The Art of Video Games, Grant Taverner suggests that a game must, by definition, be intended as an object of entertainment, an assumption adopted uncritically by most other scholars. Gonzalo Frasca, for example, defines games as any forms of computer-based entertainment software using any electronic platform and involving one or multiple players. Now, you're smart, so at this point, I'm confident you've spotted the problem. If we accept that games must inherently first and foremost be entertainment products, and we accept that classical music must function as art as opposed to entertainment or some other ancillary function, then the two are mutually exclusive. By definition, they cannot be combined. And yet they are, and often. Mixing classical music and video games thus always transgresses boundaries. In one way or another, it issues an existential challenge. The complex questions raised by this seeming impossibility are the subject of my forthcoming book, Unlimited Replays. For today, though, I'd like to offer up a few recent examples of how this conflict plays out. Specifically, I'm interested today in instances where cracks develop in the walls between classical music and games, allowing one to move into the cultural space typically occupied by the other. In my first example, that cultural space is your pocket. In 2015, one of Business Insider's executive editors wrote a brief article in the magazine calling attention to a new smartphone game, which he was, quote, totally obsessed with beating. Now, that might not seem like a particularly noteworthy attitude towards a mobile game. Who among us has not had our free time run aground in the shallows of Candy Crush or Flappy Bird? No, What makes this situation unusual is that here, beating the game essentially means correctly performing an avant-garde piece of classical music. A collaboration between the London Sinfonietta, Queen Mary University of London, and the developer Rochester Press, which is now Amphio, this app attempts to create just the kind of obsession that Business Insider's editor described, and it does. New York Times critic, for example, found it, quote, maddeningly addictive. Now, I've been a music educator in one form or another for most of my adult life, and I'm fairly confident I have never heard anyone describe learning a piece as maddeningly addictive. So what's going on? Part of the answer lies with the music in question. Steve Reich's clapping music. I'm sure most of you are familiar with Reich's deceptively simple 1970s minimalist work, which creates a rich and musically rewarding experience from a small amount of musical material. It creates that experience, I would argue, through a process not entirely unlike a video game. Like many games, Reich's work begins with a basic premise and a simple set of rules. One performer repeats the same rhythmic pattern, while the other performer shifts by one beat every few repetitions. It's built on a single musical element, rhythm, which happens to be the one element that music games handle well. Yet while many music-based video games give players the sense of performing music, in the clapping music app, players are in effect reproducing the complete work. Now, at this point, a demonstration seems in order, and I would encourage anyone with an iPhone or iPad to download it and give themselves a shot at it later, preferably after my talk is done. One of the advertisements for this app provides an introduction from Reich himself, as well as some background information on why the app was made in the first place. So that's a nice place for us to start.
Hi. I'm Steve Reich. In 1972, I composed a piece called Clapping Music, and all it needs is your two hands. It's a simple piece. There's just one rhythmic pattern. One person plays it over and over again, and the second gradually changes their part one note at a time. This app is very helpful. It'll teach you to play the piece, and it will prepare you to play it live. The goal is to follow the dots, play the pattern exactly as it's presented, but if you miss, game's over for a minute, and then you can try again. And when you're all done, just in case you're interested, you might check out a few other pieces I've written that you might enjoy. Do give the clapping music app a try. It's a bit of a challenge, but it's an interesting one, and you can download it for nothing.
So, there's a lot to unpack in Reich's short statement, and we can certainly talk more about that during the Q&A. But what's most interesting to me is that he clearly views the app not only as an enjoyable and interesting experience, but also as a gateway to live performance. As one of its original performers recently noted, clapping music demands a different kind of virtuosity from its performers. It showcases their concentration, endurance, rhythmic precision, consistency, phrasing within repetition, and comfort with metrical and perceptual ambiguity. The app cleverly facilitates the development of exactly those skills, and upon completing the game on the highest difficulty setting, which is quite a challenge, let me tell you, players are ready to perform clapping music. Musical elements like rhythmic accuracy are easy to assess and quantify into a numerical score, and indeed, tracing the improvement of these skills over time is partly why the app was created in the first place. Now, you might have noticed some other options that Reich discusses about the music, about the app, and research project, all of which are available from the opening screen. Users who explore the third option, research project, are sent to a website detailing a set of goals, or at least they used to be. The last time I checked, the website had gotten an error message saying it was temporarily down, but I hope they'll be able to restore that. According to that site, aside from creating a fun game, the app was designed to answer two questions. One, how are musical performance skills acquired through a digital game interface? And two, Can audience engagement with a new music genre be increased by a game-based smartphone app? Now, the second question isn't too surprising. A number of classical music apps function as updated music appreciation tools, albeit typically for more standard classical fare. In the case of clapping music, players can read program notes. Let me see if I can get there. There we go. Players can read program notes from the composer, watch an interview with him, or see recorded performances of clapping music. They can also learn more about the game's sponsors or delve into Reich's other works with video examples and the option to purchase the music through iTunes. Where Steve Reich's classic clapping music differs significantly from most classical music apps, however, is question number 1, which deals with the development of practical musical abilities. A number of studies have addressed games' potential impact on the development of musical skills, such as musical theory or sight reading. Yet clapping music is something different in degree, if not necessarily in kind. Here the line between developing fundamental skills and actually performing music becomes blurred into unrecognizability. At some point, for both players and listeners, playing this game becomes virtually indistinguishable from a musical performance. The Steve Reich clapping music app raises some fundamental questions about learning, performing, and consuming classical music in the digital era. Exactly how gamified can classical music become before it stops being art and starts being entertainment? And when, if ever, can classical music become a game? My next example considers the same questions, but from the opposite perspective. When can a work of game music become classical, and what happens when game music invades the symphony hall? It's no secret that many orchestras have struggled financially in recent years. Dwindling audiences, insufficient charitable giving, and a myriad of other complex issues have resulted in labor disputes and even bankruptcies. Over the past decade or so, video game concerts have increasingly provided one remedy for orchestras eager to draw in new audiences. Once dismissed as fringe events, really gimmicks, orchestral game music concerts have become a staple of ensembles ranging from local community orchestras to elite professional ensembles. These concerts offer a glimpse into shifting understandings of classical music in the digital age and interact in complicated ways with the symphony orchestra's traditional role as bastion of high art. The first orchestral game music concerts took place in Japan in the 1990s, but since the early 2000s, they've become equally prominent in Europe and North America. In terms of press coverage and critical awareness, however, 2015 seems to have been the watershed year. One widely circulated article in the Wall Street Journal, for example, noted that game music is inspiring a new generation of symphony patron that is invigorating the bottom line performance of concert halls across the US. The author, Sarah Needleman, offers examples from orchestras and performance venues across the country, noting that tickets for game music concerts often sell for double the amount as normal pops concerts, and that audience members purchase substantially more merchandise. Aside from this short-term burst of much-needed income, however, the strategy seems to be using game music to lure younger and more culturally diverse audiences, some of whom, theoretically, go on to become regular patrons. It's still too early to know if such a strategy will ultimately be successful for these orchestras, but the immediate benefits are obvious. Yet not all musicians and concertgoers appreciate the incursion of video game music into the sacred concert hall space. Needleman's article includes one such naysayer. From a business strategy perspective, it completely devalues the brand, says Roderick Branch, a 39-year-old lawyer in Chicago who attends symphony orchestra performances about once a week. The very idea, he said, is akin to Mouton Rothschild using its wine to make and sell sangria. Branch, who I strongly suspect is a delight to be around, suggests that performing video game music devalues not only the concert on which it is performed, but tarnishes the image of the orchestra itself. His final analogy is particularly revealing. The Bordeaux produced by Chateau Mouton Rothschild, an estate founded in the 19th century, is one of the world's most celebrated and expensive wines. Often selling for hundreds of dollars per bottle, the wine is a symbol of both quality and exclusivity, a distinctly old-world European luxury limited to a select few. Sangria, on the other hand, is a much less exalted drink. Originating in Spain via the Caribbean, this popular and delicious beverage made its way to the United States largely through the immigration of Hispanic peoples, leading many to associate the drink with Mexico and its cuisine. Thus, when Branch suggests that game music concerts are akin to Mouton Rothschild using its wine to make and sell sangria, he protests the use of an elite European product like the orchestra to produce a less expensive product designed for mass appeal and consumption. In fairness, it's not hard to understand why some traditionally minded audience members and critics might share Branch's perspective. Often the ways game music is presented live differ dramatically from traditional classical concerts. The popular video games live tour, for instance, pairs local orchestras with traveling multimedia shows featuring fog machines, laser light shows, and a jumbotron playing video game footage. Despite the unusual presentation, Video Games Live is impresario Tommy Tallarico, seen here performing, remains adamant that video game music has crossed some philosophical or artistic line and become classical. Game music's relationship to classical composers is a recurring motif in Tallarico's interviews, with one of his most frequent claims being that Beethoven would have been a game music composer had he been born in our time. In one 2013 interview, for instance, he defended game music against its detractors by claiming that symphonic game music is, quote, modern-day classical music. The only thing that's different is that all of our composers are still alive. The truth is, we're just as relevant as Beethoven and Mozart, and we're just as good. Though I'm not sure he wins any points for modesty, Tallarico's viewpoint has a growing number of supporters who believe that symphonic game music either already is or can readily be transformed into classical music. I turn now to a few examples of what that process of classification looks like from both fans and the musicians themselves. The UK-based radio station Classic FM boldly promises its listeners the world's greatest music. Each year since 1996, the radio station gives its British audience of over 6 million listeners the opportunity to vote for their favorite classical works. From those results, the station compiles its annual Hall of Fame, the 300 works receiving the most nominations. In 2016, more than 170,000 aficionados cast votes. And as usual, the resulting list offers an unconventional perspective. For example, many unsuspecting listeners might be shocked by number 17, Nobuo Uematsu's music from the Final Fantasy series. Although still impressive, 17th place is quite a drop for Uematsu. In 2013, Final Fantasy reached number 3. That same year, Jeremy Soule's music for the Elder Scrolls series joined Uematsu in the top 10. And as Tommy Tallarico would no doubt be pleased to point out, both of them were ranked higher than any work by Beethoven or Mozart. Game music didn't make it to the top of the Hall of Fame without help from some devoted fans and a clear agenda. For several years, there's been a concerted effort by game music fans to inundate online polls with as many votes as possible. For example, there's a Facebook group with about 2,500 followers called Keep Video Games Music in the Classic FM Hall of Fame. Alongside regular updates on game music concerts, this group issues reminders to vote in the Hall of Fame polls and reports the results. The About section for the group identifies it as, quote, an ongoing campaign for the recognition of video game scores as classical music, fantastic music by incredible composers that deserves to be praised. Since 2015, the group has a related Twitter account, which liked one of my tweets yesterday, the biographical statement of which simply notes, "We campaign for the recognition of orchestral video game music." Run by UK-based advocates, this account routinely tweets messages concerning upcoming game music concerts and recordings and serves as a communication hub for fans. The central tenet of groups like these, and there are quite a number of them, isn't simply promoting game music. Instead, they demand a re-evaluation of at least some types of it as classical music, and therefore, in their view, as worthy of serious artistic consideration. Such an idea is at once subversive and traditionalist. On the one hand, it undermines the exclusivity of classical music by arguing for the inclusion of popular culture products under its umbrella. But on the other hand, it reinforces the fundamental principle on which classical music is based. Some music is art, and other music isn't. In other words, the barbarians at the gate aren't tearing down the walls, they just want to come in for tea. Having game music declared classical becomes a moral victory, a validation and a vindication of the tastes of its long-suffering fans. But those fans aren't the only ones encouraging listeners to perceive game music as classical. For example, in 2013, the same year Final Fantasy hit number 3 on the Classic FM Hall of Fame, the London Symphony played a game music concert at the Barbican Centre called Final Symphony, an event that led one games writer to declare that, quote, video game music has pretty officially made it. Removing game music from its original context and repositioning it in an illustrious and traditionally classical venue has a profound impact on audience perception. To quote the musicologist James Parakilis, when classical music is performed at Avery Fisher Hall or the Met, there's no more reason to call it classical than there is to label music at the Schubert Theater Broadway or music at a square dance folk. The place places it. In other words, if an orchestra is playing in a venue like the Barbican, then whatever they play is in essence functioning as classical music. True enough. But that's not the end of the story here. I would also suggest that some game music programs, like Final Symphony, are conceived, arranged, and marketed in such a way as to emphasize their most classical aspects. Final Symphony was produced by Thomas Böcker, who runs the successful Germany-based Spielekonzert series. Since his first concerts in 2003, Böcker's productions have emphasized both their novelty and their classical heritage. The website is full of images of formally dressed musicians in elegant concert halls, like this one. And the text strongly reinforces the perception of a strictly high-class affair. For the first time, one section reads, Decca, a leading label for classical music, released a live concert recording of video game music. And with this, again, for the first time, video game music reached the top 15 in the German classical music charts. Furthermore, as the site proudly notes, the 2015 studio recording of Final Symphony reached the top of the iTunes classical charts in more than 10 countries and appeared in the classical album top 5 of both the Billboard charts and the official UK charts. In the same vein, instead of the straightforward transcriptions and medleys featured on many video game concerts, Final Symphony more thoroughly reimagines its original source material, adapting it into classical forms and styles. There's a symphonic poem, a symphony, and a piano concerto, each based on themes from a different Final Fantasy game. Now, if you want to emphasize that these are classical orchestral works, I really can't think of better genres to do it. Symphonies and concertos in particular have for centuries been testing grounds for composers looking to be taken seriously. As for the musical style, the Final Symphony seems to draw heavily on early 20th century musical modernism. To my ear, Stravinsky and Prokofiev are the closest analogs, with some John Williams thrown in for good measure. One of the promotional videos for the recording gives us a sense of the sound and features a revealing interview with Final Fantasy composer Uematsu. Though I've made a cut, this is actually still a fairly long video, but I think it's important to understanding this work.
なんかこうファイナルファンタジーの曲が好きだって言ってくれてる人が世の中に大勢いて、でしかもすごく才能のある人たちが音楽のアレンジに参加してもらって、 一言では言えないけど生まれてきてよかったなと思いますね僕が僕が始めた頃はゲーム機がまだファミコンっていうすごくシンプルなゲーム機だったんですね。ですから音楽なんかも電子音ピーとかブーとかいう電子音も3つだけで音楽を作らなきゃなんなかったんですよ。でそれがだんだんゲーム機の進化に伴ってその電子音3音しか使えなかったのがサンプリング音源8つ使えるようになったり32個かな使えるようになったりしているうちにだんだんこんなスタジオで録音したものもゲームに取り込めるようになったんですよ。でそういうゲーム機の進化による音楽の質の向上っていうのもあると思うんですけど、もっと大きいのはね20数年の間にゲームを遊んだ子どもたちが僕もゲーム音楽を作ってみたいと思ってちゃんと音楽を学んで音大の作曲家を出てゲーム音楽に就職するゲーム音楽を作るようになる時代になってきてるんですよ。ゲーム音楽コンサートって世の中にいっぱいあるんですけど、いわゆるゲーム音楽に忠実なあまりずれないゲーム音楽を思い起こさせるような、聴きやすいアレンジがなされてるんですよ大概の場合は。ファイナルシンフォニーが一番違うのはねもっとアーティスティックにアートに自由な解釈をされていて、なんならちょっともう現代音楽に近いような部分もたくさんあるんですね。それって面白いなという、いわゆるエンターテインメントとしての音楽だったのがちょっと現代音楽風にシフトしてるぞこのファイナルシンフォニーは。それはちょっと新しいなと思いますね。
The musical values embedded in Uematsu's message are hard to miss. Despite his own prog rock background, the composer seems to privilege classical training, or as he calls it, studying music properly, in a university setting. And by separating music composed in a game music style from music written in an artistic manner, he suggests that there's a fundamental incompatibility between those concepts. That artistic manner, he implies, results from the arrangements being closer to contemporary classical music, which I interpret to mean music after about 1900 rather than specifically music being composed today. Finally, to make things absolutely clear, Uematsu points out that incorporating classical elements shifts the music away from being entertainment and presumably towards being art. Certainly, Uematsu's interview is a form of marketing, and all self-deprecation aside, Final Fantasy's success translates into his own cultural and financial profit. Yet his tone reinforces the distinction between game music and art music, even as he lauds the arrangers of Final Symphony for transforming his music from the former into the latter. Repeatedly throughout the interview, Uematsu emphasizes the superiority of classical training and musical styles over earlier game styles, including his own. Transforming game music into art is thus at the core of Final Symphony. In every aspect of its design, it's crafted to present game music in a form appealing to both devotees of game music and classical music. And just to be clear, Final Symphony is hardly alone in that effort, as I probably don't need to tell you. Another of the most popular touring game concerts, for example, is The Legend of Zelda Symphony of the Goddesses, an ongoing concert program premiered in 2012 featuring a 4-movement symphony of the same name. It's difficult to speculate what, if any, long-term effects these more classically inspired adaptations of game music will have on the orchestral repertoire, or whether they will ever gain wide acceptance as classical works. In the meantime, however, these programs, along efforts like the campaigns for game music and the Classic FM Hall of Fame, raise questions about what classical music means to 21st century listeners. The coming years will teach us all whether classical music can embrace game music and the diverse new audience that comes along with it. So, what are we to make of all this? I've tried here to briefly sketch a picture of two converging trends. On the one hand, we have apps like Steve Reich's clapping music, which convert classical music into video games. On the other, we have avid fans and concert performers like Final Symphony working to turn video game music classical. Both instances make efforts to bridge the cultural gap that separates classical music from video games. That's a gap that already seems to be getting smaller. Video games still, by and large, lack the cultural cachet of classical music, but maybe things are changing. Games are increasingly recognized for their capability to tell meaningful stories, to produce insightful political and cultural commentary, and to make artistic statements. Less obviously, and at a positively glacial pace, perceptions of classical music also continue to evolve. In search of financial security and social relevance, some among the classical music world have earnestly begun to explore ways to reach new audiences, including through video game music. All these signs point to a future where the artificial distinctions between highbrow and lowbrow are erased, and where games and other entertainment forms can stand alongside the art of classical music. But we're not there just yet. In fact, I remain confident that the interaction of video games and classical music will continue to create sites of friction and juxtaposition for some time to come. However problematic or arbitrary they may be, centuries of ingrained value judgments regarding art and entertainment aren't easy to eradicate if indeed we want to get rid of them at all. Even the clapping music app and the Final Symphony depend on classical music's lofty cultural position to give them prestige. The clapping music app aims to prove that contemporary music is fun and accessible, and to help players develop the skills necessary to play it. Meanwhile, Final Symphony is still trying to show that game music is just as good as Beethoven. In both cases, they treat classical music as an aspirational goal, even as they challenge some of its tenets. The situation is similar on the classical music side. Whatever lip service arts organizations pay to increasing their accessibility and diversity, from a certain perspective, those goals are self-defeating. As the sociologist Pierre Bourdieu might say, a taste for classical music is a self-conscious mark of distinction. Some performers and audience members still rely on classical music's aura of high-class exclusivity as proof of their own intelligence, sophistication, and wealth. Consequently, efforts to broaden classical music's appeal through games, particularly by bringing its music into classical concert spaces, seem bound to ruffle feathers. And I would be remiss if I didn't mention my own experience as a musicologist. In some settings, there remains a palpable sense that game music research is frivolous, somehow less important or rigorous than the study of established classical music. I once had a presentation scheduled for the final session of a long academic conference, and I told Neil I was going to mention this. This is actually, as far as I know, the first session at a major musicology conference on video game music. Will Cheng and I presented, Neil chaired the session. I was told we were scheduled for the final session of a long conference because, as one of the organizers cheerfully told me, they wanted to end with something fun after people were burned out from the serious topics. Or consider the well-meaning colleague from another university who earnestly told me that my application for tenure was in good shape because my legit research balanced out the game stuff. As long as we struggle to define what art is and what it means, these debates over cultural value will play out over and over. My reaction to that conclusion is equal parts chagrin and delight. Chagrin, because the questions I set out to answer in this talk and in my research more broadly are ultimately unanswerable. And delight, because I can't wait to try puzzling out the next example of how classical music and video games interact. In short, in the digital age, dichotomies like art and entertainment, high art and low art, or classical music and video games mean precisely what they have always meant: everything and nothing. Thank you.
Thank you. That was wonderful. It seems to me that video game music occupies a position today that film music did at one time, even to the point of orchestras then showing films, as another way to revitalize. The good news, I guess, for game music is that film music has now canonized itself or become canonic. So my question might be, what after video game music?
That's an excellent question, and I think you raise a good point. And often I hear people, just audiences, this is purely anecdotal information, but I hear people say, well, we're not quite where film music is in terms of cultural, authenticity and cultural value, which is precisely what people used to say 20 years ago about performing film music or further back. However, to somewhat challenge what you're saying, I recently was talking to someone who, since I'm being streamed, I won't go into any more information, but talking to someone who works on programming for a major symphony orchestra, and he said that they wanted to do an Oscars concert near Oscar season, and the orchestra rebelled because they only play pops during pop season, and film music is pops, and so they actually had to enter mediation, and at that point, what the orchestra got to do was vote on whether individual film was art or not. And so, Bernard Herrmann is art, Max Steiner is art, John Williams is entertainment, Danny Elfman is entertainment. And so I think there's still some kind of gatekeeping that goes on, even, within the sort of monolithic categories of game music and film music. In games, I think what we're seeing is that some genres have more cultural cachet than others. I see a lot of role-playing game music on concerts, and not a lot of racing game music on concerts. So I think we're seeing this kind of stratification of cultural capital within there.
Thank you.
Well, thank you.
You get to pick.
Hey, Will.
Hi, Dana.
So I'm just going to ask you to kind of expand upon something that you and I have had a lot of conversations about, and that has to do with self-conscious choices to look at more symphonic or classical game scores as a musicologist, as a legitimizing thing, and then also the canon formation, within Ludomusicology.
So when I was prepping this talk, actually I got halfway through a totally different talk that I was going to give, sort of looking at Ludomusicology 10 years in, and it was going to be called Dodging the Canon, and it even had a screen, like a thing of Mario avoiding those canon things. So one of these days I'll do that. But as Dana and some of you probably know, I'm very resistant to the idea of us creating a canon of video game music, because I think we're going to just fall into the same exact traps that the classical canon has fallen into. I noticed that there are very few papers at any of our conferences about women composers, for example, despite the fact that the conference has very helpfully had keynote composers Winifred Phillips and Pinka Kuneva, for example. So I think we're in danger of sort of replicating pre-existing problems. And I think it's interesting that the video game music that's being canonized, or I think we're moving towards in live performance and in our own work, tends to be that which most closely approximates classical music. And so as much as we like to say that we're getting away from it, I think sometimes we replicate what we're most familiar with. That's not always true, and I don't mean that to challenge people who are, well, maybe I do mean that to challenge people who are here, including myself, as I'm co-editing a book on role-playing game music, for example.
Just to kind of follow up on that a little
Sure.
bit. So, how, especially younger career scholars, which this field is full of, speak a little bit to that notion of we have to convince our own departments, or we have to, get into these conferences in the first place. And so, again, there's that strategic, self-conscious side of it, that it's not just a matter of trying to canonize these things because we like them, but there's also this self-conscious side of it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I absolutely agree with that. And I tell anyone, if anybody's listening who's pursuing a PhD or plans to do that in musicology or music theory, I always recommend having at least 2 areas that you're working in, just because there's some resistance, and if video game music is your second area, that's wonderful as well. But yeah, I mean, it's a practical consideration. Oh, before Ryan asks this, no doubt, fantastic question, I wanted to, in the vein of shameless gratification, if anybody wants to purchase this, feel free to take a photo. They say the day you're photographed most is your wedding day, but I think this is, you know, in the absence of that for me, I think I'm at the top of my list now. Oh, wow.
Great.
What? As ad infinitum, as far as I know.
Will, while people take their photos, I
Yeah,
want
please,
to ask
sorry,
a
Ryan.
quick question.
Yeah.
And that is, I feel like there have been gestures amongst for lack of a better term, I'll use the words that you've kind of put forward here. After seeing that fantastic and fantastically offensive quote about sangria, which I love sangria. Get wrecked, dude. There have been gestures towards, again, shorthand, I'm not prepped to respond to this, diversifying the orchestra. For instance, if you listen to a lot of NPR, about once a month, the commentator, the host who plays the music, will gush all over Joaquin Rodrigo's guitar concerto. And it's a fantastic, like, I play it for my students every once in a while when I hear somebody say, oh, jazz and classical music aren't compatible. Oh, my culture's music is not compatible. And my answer is always, it could be if the effort would be made. And for me, the Rodrigo guitar concerto proves that point. But my question is related to this highbrow versus lowbrow perception of certain things. Christopher Tin, a century later than Rodrigo, his Civilization 4 song, The Lord's Prayer in Swahili, has been relatively well integrated into like the choral repertoire of high schools and college choirs. It gets not routinely performed all the time, but no one would blink twice today if it were to show up on a program. But something, as you've hinted, like a racing game, or like the electric guitar, for instance, is very rarely performed with the orchestra. And is there a resistance to certain types of, again, for lack of a better term, we'll call it instrumental diversity, regardless of what culture that happens to be coming out of and from, with the orchestra? In some ways, you talk about Tommy Tallarico's Video Games Live program. One of his great musical successes with all of those arrangements is forcing us to pair different instruments with the traditional orchestra that we would not otherwise be hearing.
That's a wide-ranging question.
I'm really sorry.
Yeah. So I think, yes, I do think there's a lot of resistance from orchestras to new instrumentation. We sort of have this idea, I think, a lot of times in classical music world, that the way things are now is the way things have always been. For people who are obsessed with history, we don't do a very good job of understanding it sometimes, in terms of the makeup of ensembles, in terms of how the economics of orchestras worked historically versus now, and in terms of, yeah, I mean, just the instrumentation that's in there. It was only fixed in our standard orchestra, 100 years ago. I do think we see examples of people. Mason Bates is a very clear example for me, who, in sort of incorporating electronic dance music into the orchestra, has really sort of carved a niche for himself. And is getting a lot of playtime, and I think orchestras are noticing that kind of thing more often. I'm also thinking of works like Super Collider, which incorporates the gamelan in a sort of a Lou Harrison way. I think a lot of what we sort of term indie classical now is branching out from that. But I think it's also important to note that a lot of times that music is being performed outside of traditional venues. It's performed on pop series, it's performed on other things. And we don't usually see that infiltrating what sometimes orchestras call their masterworks concerts, which are really dedicated to everything up to about Prokofiev and then nothing thereafter. Does that somewhat answer what you're getting at?
Yeah, just certain types of resistance that, like, certain diversities, certain new concepts, whether that's, again, role-playing games, some things are highly preferenced for reasons that are, when you look at them, they're weird,
Yeah, and there's a form of tokenism that goes into that too. We like Rodrigo, for example, but name another composer kind of in a similar boat. It's hard to do that.
Right, exactly.
Or, I think it's sort of, yes. You're exactly right about the privileging of certain forms of diversity.
Hi, Will.
Hi, Julianne.
I have a question about something that I think, I'm staring at this kind of pixelated Beethoven here, and I'm thinking about how a lot of sort of defense of just regular classical music performance comes from this sort of preservationist attitude. And I've talked with a lot of people that go to these concerts and also produce these concerts too. And there's a little bit of that preservationist attitude as well, just in video games generally, right? Because, the sort of really quick cycle of obsolescence and just like the actual hardware itself kind of just fading with time, and, Moore's Law, yeah, I did look it up, where, we're sort of just moving so quickly towards a different kind of sound. And so I guess I was wondering if you encountered because this is something that's a little different from standard pops concerts and film music concerts that don't seem to suffer, maybe not suffer, but sort of talk about the whole museumification and preservation of something that could be lost. So, yeah.
Yeah, so as some of you know, I was not always a video game scholar. My first book is called Building the Operatic Museum, and it's about the creation of museum culture in the French music scene in the early 20th century. And while I've been working on this, I just keep finding these sorts of parallels where we do sort of start to see the same things and the same arguments cropping up about video game music that were happening 100 years ago. We have to keep the old things in the repertoire because then we won't, the new doesn't make sense unless you understand it in the context of the old, which I'm not going to argue with that. And while that argument, I think, has somewhat faded away or itself become obsolete in terms of what we would think of as mainstream classical music, because, if your orchestra doesn't record Beethoven 5 again, that's okay. We're not going to forget what Beethoven 5 is. There are, I believe, 2 or 3 other recordings of it. But it is somewhat difficult with game music. It's a different ballpark. And in game studies, as many of you know, I'm sure, in game studies as a larger field, this is a major topic of concern because things are gone. There are just games that we know existed and there are no copies that are extant, or we have no technology that can play these things. And so there are people who are undertaking really massive preservation projects that are much like we do with wax cylinders or something like that. So in video game music, I do think there is that, and I think there is that need that we still have to kind of document and assess in a way that maybe doesn't exist still within classical music. We sort of know what Josquin wrote, maybe, I don't know, maybe that's a bad example, but in a way that we don't necessarily have a catalog for video game composers. Marty's not here, he had to step out, I think, but many of us were tweeting yesterday, I had no idea he wrote the music for that game or that game or that game. We just don't have a solid knowledge of the kind of corpus for composers. And as people were pointing out, sometimes they're working under, the Capcom team was working under pseudonyms, and I recognize names that I didn't realize they did this. And so there's still a lot of kind of positivist musicological work that I think could fruitfully be undertaken by the enterprising graduate student. To quote some 1950s jams at you.